Okay guys, today I'm going to show you how to safely cut small pieces of wood with your miter saw. As you can see here, I like to make geometric wood wall art. And these little pieces here, these smaller pieces, can be pretty tricky to cut and a little confusing if you're not used to cutting small pieces of wood with your miter saw. So I want to show you the safe way to do this to get those small cuts without getting your hands anywhere near the saw blade. Okay, if this was a new piece that I was making and I was trying to cut out the little pieces to fit inside of it, I have a whole video showing exactly how I plan layouts, how I build mosaics, just like this one, actually exactly this one. I can show you how to build that. But I lay everything out before I glue anything down, and I make sure I've got really nice tight fitting pieces. So for something like this, I would lay it out and draw a pencil mark and just offcut the square pieces. Now the square pieces are less confusing when you're new to this. I think it gets confusing when you start doing these angle pieces. So generally as a beginner, I recommend keeping all of your angles 45s. That makes it nice and easy for you to figure out how to cut the pieces. So if I wanted to cut something like this bigger triangle or even this tiny triangle, I would start by putting a 45 on the board I'm going to use. Now the tiny triangle I can do with this 1x2. The larger one, I probably used a 1x3 to cut this one, but it could be any of your scrap wood as long as it's long enough for you to keep your hands away from the saw blade. So really with that tiny piece, I would carefully mark it on the board before I cut it, but if you think about it, it's actually just like a corner like this. So if I make sure that I've got the right size, I could go straight into a 45-degree angle here and cut that right off and it'd be perfect. So if I get it wrong the first time, if it's too small or too large with something like this, I'm not going to go in and fine-tune that tiny offcut. I'm just going to do a new offcut for that piece of the mosaic art. So the first piece, if it's not the right size, it's trash. I'm not going to try to reuse it unless it's slightly too big and then I can just sand it down. That would be all right. But I don't want to ever get my hands near that saw blade. So I'm always going to keep my hands far enough, like this far away from the saw blade. So let me just show you real quick. Another common mistake I see beginners making with their miter saw is they keep the blade on, so they're depressing it. They have it running when they pull it back up. You want to let go of the trigger, let it stop running while you're holding it down, and then pull the blade back up. Or you're going to send pieces flying and actually probably nick any of those pieces that are still flying when you're pulling it back up. So start it down, push it down, let it stop running, and then let the blade come back up. So if I was making mosaic art and I needed a piece this tiny, that would be the safe way to cut something like this without having to make a jig and without having to get your hands close to the piece of wood, or to the blade, sorry. For larger triangles, and I know already my angle, my starting angle on one side, I would cut, using a larger piece of wood like this, I would cut the angle on one side first. Now that I have my 45 on one side, I can mark where I want the 45 on the other side. So let's say I needed it to be sort of this side or into there. Then I know I want the exact right size. Then I know to come back in here with the flip on the 45. And again, the piece I'm going to keep is going to be on the right-hand side, or away from the longer piece of wood. And again, if I don't get this size right, if it's a little bit too big, maybe I can try to sand it down. But this is just small amounts of wood. I'm not going to worry about, and premium lumber, or dimensional lumber that I'm using from Lowe's or Home Depot. So I don't buy the high-end expensive lumber, so I'm not worried about losing a few inches to the burn pile or the scrap heap if I make mistakes. So now if I was doing new pieces for wood wall art, I would use this as the piece to make sure it fit into my design. And I'll tell you what, another thing, I use some of these pieces sometimes. If I cut them wrong, I'll save a big box of them, all of these little triangle bits, if they're the wrong size. My kids love to glue them together and make things. Sometimes I want to make an angled piece that might be centered perfectly along the center of the board, or a little off center like this to fill in a spot. Again, I think it's always best if you can lay it out and pencil mark exactly where you want your cuts. An easy trick for getting an arrow piece or a centered 45 on something like a 1x2 is to do the first 45 cut first, and then to use a square to mark the line a little bit hard to do when I'm holding the board up for the camera, but to mark the straight line across. You can do that even before you cut your 45. But now you know on this board where you want that other 45 to come back in so that it hits the center and makes a nice, perfectly centered triangle end piece for these. So now I would want the blade to hit right across the end of this board, and usually with these, to make sure I'm not going to make a mistake the first time, I'll sort of go a little bit to the right of it or a little bit further out and then kind of inch my way back in. That helps you avoid making mistakes better than, you know, just going for the perfect cut the first time and then realizing you were a little bit off. So that's a little bit off, but I know if normally I wouldn't have picked the board back up. I would have just slightly moved it to make up that difference, but I wanted to show you. So that's a little bit off. And normally I would have just then slightly moved that board a little bit in to make up the difference. So now I've got a perfect center on that 1x2 board with a 45 angle on each end. I could even use this to cut this piece off now. So I've always kept my hands well away from the blade when I'm working on this. Okay, here's one final trick that I'm going to show you guys for cutting small pieces for this mosaic wood wall art on your miter saw. So sometimes during these builds I have to make a cut that goes across the length of a board. Again, I want to use my miter saw because it's easier than using a slide on a table saw, at least for me. And you want to keep your fingers well away from the blade, of course. So, again, I usually just mark everything out. Let's say I need this to be cut a little bit smaller. If I was going to line it up perfectly and I knew that I wanted it to come across right here. Here's a trick for using your miter saw without having to make a jig. So I know I need my cut to go sort of across there. So my blade would be just at a 90th for this example. I'll use a scrap piece of wood that, again, is long enough for me to keep my hand far away, cut to the same angle as the piece I'm going to cut. And I use a piece of painter's tape to hold the two pieces of wood together, because sometimes when you start your blade, it just creates enough wind to blow those little pieces up. So the tape is going to hold that in place. So the board that I'm using on the left-hand side of this to cut this has got to be the same thickness as the board that you're cutting. So just remember that. Then I come in with another piece of wood. Now I can go all the way across this and hold it down nice and safe and make it a cut and just have this be a sacrificial piece of wood. Or I can use this, let me move this. Or I can use this board as my guide when I am lining up my blade. So let's say I wanted to make sure I cut this off. I could use this board to line up my blade. Just sort of gently press that board up against the blade. I don't want it too tight. But now I know my blade is going to hit where I want it to cut off that piece of wood. And I can hold the piece down with the board on top. And my hands again are well away from the blade. So now I've made my cut and everything stayed in place, nothing flew up, my hands were well away from the blade, and I got a cross cut on this without having to really make a jig or keep track of where the jig is that I made the last time I did this cut. So this is just a quick way to do this and still be safe. Okay, that's it guys. I hope that helped you figure out how to make those tiny cuts using just your miter saw. No need for a jig, no need for a slide. And you can design and make all of the beautiful wood mosaic art that you want, cutting all of those tiny pieces with just your miter saw.